Just imagine if there were superplants. Plants that are quite normal in appearance, but have almost magical abilities.
There's a number of plants that are very unusual in accumulating metals from the soils.
People always ask me, can you obtain gold with them? Yes, you can.
There are plants that store so much heavy metal in their leaves that you can use them to decontaminate soil. Other plants can be used to obtain raw materials, from platinum to silicon.
So the plants can do crazy things with their genome, and we don't have the faintest idea how it works.
The research on these superplants is still very new, but now the time is ripe for a scientific revolution.
I mean, I found a plant with 50% silicium. I say we could make glass out of these leaves.
Our journey to the superplants begins on the other side of the world, in the South Sea archipelago of New Caledonia, in the middle of the Pacific. The main New Caledonian island of Grande Terre is a holiday paradise surrounded by coral reefs and with a unique natural habitat. Because New Caledonia is so isolated, a completely separate plant world has developed here. Almost everything that grows here cannot be found anywhere else in the world. A paradise of biodiversity. This is the other face of New Caledonia. The island lives off nickel mining. The mines provide profit and jobs, but the price for the environment is enormous. Whole hilltops are removed in strip mining procedures. Left behind are waste dumps full of toxic heavy metals. 10% of global nickel reserves lie on the small island. Good for the economy, but very problematic for nature. However, this very nature can also contribute to the solution of the environmental problems. Here in the jungle of Grande Terre, scientist Anthony van der Ent of the Australian University of Queensland is researching plants with bizarre abilities. Plants that can simply draw heavy metals such as nickel from the ground.
We have a really large individual of Pichinendra cutuminata here, which is famous all around the world for containing a blue-green sap that has 25% nickel in it. So I'm going to make a small cut in the tree to exudate some sap that we then can collect and analyze. We should see some sap coming out soon. The green color you can see from the sap is actually the color of nickel. I can use a little bit of test paper to press against it, and we should see a pretty strong color reaction. So the amount of nickel in this sap is between 20 and 25%, which makes it the strangest biological liquid known to man. That is really quite extraordinary to think there's so much metal contained in the sap of a living, healthy tree.
Nickel is extremely toxic to plants, animals, and people. This tree shouldn't actually exist.
I could not believe that a tree would absorb so much metal that is toxic into its organism, into its leaf and into its trunk, and grow happily and healthy and thrive on it.
The nickel tree is certainly not the only plant here that is able to extract and accumulate metals from the ground. New Caledonia is full of these so-called hyper-accumulators. Anthony van der Ent collects these plants and preserves them. He does this by freezing them in liquid nitrogen. The researcher then takes the frozen plants to Australia to examine them more closely.
We start systematically by screening plants from all different families from all across New Caledonia and measure the amount of nickel in the leaves. And by doing that, we can then subsequently collect them, grow them, and potentially find the ultimate hyperaccumulator crop. New Caledonia is probably the best place in the world to study hyperaccumulator plants because they occur in many different families. There's over 65 species that we know to date, which makes it unique globally.
The fact that these strange plants have developed just here is probably due to the geological properties of the island. The soil in New Caledonia contains so much nickel and other metals that most normal plants are hardly able to grow here. In contrast, the hyperaccumulators feel perfectly at home here. The next day, Anthony van der Ent takes us for a helicopter flight over the island. We head for one of the largest nickel mines. On the coast lies the loading station for the mine. In the past, incidents occurred here time and time again. A chemical spill, angry protests by the locals. Now, though, the mining companies are also investing in environmental programs. The land around the mines is to be rehabilitated with the help of the SUPERPLANTS. Today, Anthony van der Ent is visiting the field trial of a mining company. A kind of superplant plantation is to be created in the wasteland near the mine. The problem? The ground in this area is so saturated with metals that its surface is as hard as stone. In order to be able to plant anything at all, the workers must use a special drill.
It's a very harsh environment. This is about 60 to 70 degrees in summer. So you can cook an egg on it. Yeah.
And the plants still persist in it.
And the plants still persist in it, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. It's basically pure iron oxide, is it?
Yeah, well there is 3% chrome, there is some nickel in it, and manganese.
Okay. But no nutrients at all?
No nutrients at all. Real good. Basically, they improve the soil quality. There's some that fix nitrogen. There's some that accumulate metals. They basically stabilize the soil because this area we receive 5 meters of rain per year. And so they will reduce the erosion in this area. The plants are about a year old and they will probably cover the surface of the ground in about 3 to 4 years.
Of course, this is just a beginning. And, of course, the mining companies are not doing this because they want to, but because they are legally obliged to rehabilitate the land around the mines. But at least something is growing here again, thanks to the SUPERPLANTS. We continue our journey to another mine. It's one of the largest in New Caledonia. Here, researchers are testing a fascinating idea on behalf of the mine operator. They're planting hyper-accumulators on the waste dumps contaminated with heavy metals. And not only for the purpose of rehabilitation, but also in order to harvest the metal-saturated leaves and obtain nickel from them. Nickel which can then be processed and sold.
I'm here with Bruno Fogliani from the New Caledonian Agronomic Institute, who has set up this trial here and propagating nickel hyperaccumulator plants on mining waste here. We're on a waste dump, and as you can see, they're doing quite well.
This plant accumulates nickel, so we are interested in collecting the nickel from the leaves. We try to find the best way to obtain the biggest biomass for economic exploitation. We try several fertilizers. We try also to plant with other plants. And also we try to develop the plantation with other plants as with a restoration point of view. Not only plant this species, but plant other species, and after you can leave it like this, and nature will make its work and restore naturally.
Helping the environment and simultaneously harvesting nickel in order to earn money. The technology is called phytomining, mining by plants. One plant that is especially suitable for this, Geozois pruinosa, a plant that accumulates large amounts of nickel. This one here, Grevillea exul, can extract manganese from the ground. If phytomining works, mining companies would have a reason to invest in superplants out of pure self-interest. Ultimately, they could then earn money by protecting the environment. And plant mining would not be any competition to their actual business either.
Phytomining is never going to replace conventional mining for the simple reason of the enormous amount of nickel mass that is being mined by the nickel mining industry. We're talking about enormous scales of operations and enormous quantities of nickel that is being produced. Many of the mines produce more than 60 kilotons of nickel each year. So we're talking about huge quantities. So phytomining is more a top-up strategy that you can use as part of the rehabilitation after the mining has already happened. So the mining obviously only extracts the very highest resources. So generally they only go after soils that contain more than 1% nickel, whereas hyperaccumulator plants can do the same at concentration that 10 times as low.
There will be little change to the ugly reality of nickel mining for the foreseeable future. New Caledonia is too dependent on the income from the mining industry. But the environmental problems could certainly be mitigated with the help of the superplants. This would already be a major step forward for the unique nature of New Caledonia. The fundamental research on topics relating to superplants takes place in Australia, to be precise, in Melbourne. This metropolis in the south of the continent is one of the most exciting cities in the world. It's not only a cultural and economic centre, but also home to prestigious research institutes. Located here is the Australian synchrotron, a state-of-the-art particle accelerator. Here, Anthony van der End analyzes the plants that he has collected in the jungle of New Caledonia. The question that concerns him, how exactly does the metal accumulation work?
At the moment I'm preparing a sample frame in which we are going to mount a plant sample. We bring plant samples from all around the world to the Australian synchrotron for analysis. The first thing we do is we condition them, we prepare them. In many cases, we cut out parts of a leaf, for instance, which we then mount onto a sample frame. So the information that we gather here from the experiments helps us to understand the physiology of these plants. So it helps us to understand how these plants accumulate nickel, arsenic, zinc or other metals and metalloids, and how it is distributed through the plants.
The particle accelerator is an extremely accurate and very expensive analytical instrument. Its construction alone cost 150 million euros. Anyone wanting to do research here must compete with scientists from across the whole of Australia. The fact that Anthony van der End is allowed to carry out experiments at the synchrotron shows the high regard now given to superplant research. The particle accelerator is indispensable for van der End. Only here is he able to illuminate his plant samples so as to see inside the individual cells.
This very large facility generates very bright light. In our case, we're interested in X-rays. So these X-rays, they are generated in the facility and they enter the experimental station. And in the experimental station, the X-rays arrive at the sample. So the sample moves and the X-ray beam stays stationary, it doesn't move. So we then move the sample through the X-ray beam. And by doing so, we scan the surface of the sample. So at the moment, we're looking at the results of our scan. And in this window, you can see the concentrations of different elements. So essentially, brighter colors mean that the element is present in higher concentrations. Darker means there's less of it.
The result? High-resolution images that show the researchers exactly how the metal is transported and stored in the plants.
Many hyperaccumulator plants, they have a very efficient uptake mechanism. In other words, the roots take up nickel ions or other ions from around the roots. Some hyperaccumulator plants also excrete organic acids, which dissolve minerals around the root, which then release more nickel. And in that way, they essentially increase the amount of nickel that can be released to the root. The nickel then enters into the root and is being translocated up to the shoot and to the leaves.
Through their research with the particle accelerator, the scientists have also found out why the toxic metal does not damage the plants.
In most hyperaccumulator plants, we find that nickel is located in the top part of the leaf, in the epidermal cells, which are the cells that are on the outside of the leaf. So by accumulating the nickel in those cells, it is far away from the chlorophyll, which is where photosynthesis happens. Now this photosynthesis is a very sensitive process. So if nickel, which is highly toxic to many plants, it could actually interfere with photosynthesis. But a plant has evolved mechanisms of keeping nickel away, far away from the photosynthesis apparatus.
The scientists are only very slowly beginning to understand how the superplants work. This is rather surprising, given that we have already known about hyperaccumulators for more than 40 years, but the research was stymied for a long time. In England, we meet a pioneer of superplant research in an old mining area in the Peak District. Alan Baker is a retired professor of biology, but he still frequently returns to the place where he made a spectacular discovery more than 40 years ago. Dark patches of ground caught his attention in the abandoned lead mines in the Peak District. The soil there is so highly contaminated with heavy metals that nothing grows. Lead was mined there for centuries. Today, the area lies waste. As a young researcher, Alan Baker noticed plants where there shouldn't actually be plants, an inconspicuous weed that flourished in even the most contaminated of places.
It was an amazing time for me because I just got interested in plant ecology, and I was friendly with a geologist in the Peak District, and he took me out to some of the old mine sites here. And then I saw this little plant with white flowers there. And I wondered what it was doing there. And it was very clear that it was only growing in places where there was a real lot of metals still in the soil. And then I began to ask questions. What's going on with this plant? Well, this plant here, this is the one which really is the first hyperaccumulator plant that was really known. It's a plant called the alpine pennycress, and it was the first plant that was discovered here to be a hyperaccumulator of lead, of zinc and cadmium.
Alan Baker examined the plants and then presented his results. Many thought he must have made a mistake. Plants that store so much heavy metal? Impossible. Only one researcher from the US believed him, Rufus Cheney, an official with the Environmental Protection Agency. The two of them set up a research group.
I said, look, these are properties of plants which could be harnessed, they could be useful. If we could actually make plants accumulate metals, we've got a way of stripping out metals from the zone in which their plant roots can actually reach. And that really started the story.
The revolution should actually have begun at this point. Journalists reported on the superplants. The two researchers were on the verge of a breakthrough, but then nothing happened. No university was willing to fund the scientists.
It was a difficult time to get funding, and then there was the opportunity of some venture capital coming into the system through a group of venture capitalists in the States who were prepared to back us.
Baker and Cheney began to develop the commercial use of the superplants. In exchange for their financing, all patents from their research went to the investors, the Viridian Resources Company. After a few years, Viridian suddenly lost interest and halted all experiments. But the patents remained with the company, a big problem for the researchers.
It did restrict us greatly. Now I think we are still not quite sure where we stand. But it does look as though Viridian Resources are trying to sell the technology and do it themselves. We don't have any further contact with them.
Viridian Resources doesn't talk to journalists as a rule. Our questions also went unanswered. But for Alan Baker and his team, the work has now really got going again, because the plants that he is investigating cannot be patented. Only technical processes that can be used to make money from the plants may be protected. But even such patents are only valid for 20 years, and most of them have expired in the last few years. So at long last, the revolution can proceed. Where? In a small country on the periphery of Europe, where the plants could solve urgent problems, in Albania. Here, on the shore of Lake Ohrid, lies one of the poorest regions of Europe. Hardly any industry, high levels of unemployment, and even the agriculture is unproductive, because the soil is naturally full of heavy metals. Only one thing grows everywhere here, yellow tuft. For centuries, the farmers have regarded this inconspicuous yellow plant as nothing but a weed. Now it's the bearer of hope for a better future.
No, we had no idea at all to begin with, because it was something of no value for us. It is something that was of no use for anything. Not even the animals will eat this plant. It was therefore something useless, something with no value.
The farmers here are pioneers. They will be the first farmers in the world to cultivate plants in order to harvest not food, but nickel. Yellow tuft, Alyssum murali. When this plant is harvested and burned, its ashes contain 20% nickel. It thrives in East Albania, especially on so-called serpentine soils or ultramafic soils, which contain a particularly large amount of nickel. French and Albanian scientists have jointly initiated nickel cultivation here.
10% of the surface in Albania is ultramafic. And we arrive to extract from these serpentine soils more than 100 kilo nickel per hectare.
The region around Poiska in East Albania can certainly use the nickel project. The people here don't have much, a little agriculture, but the soils are frequently too poor for growing crops, too much nickel. A few animals, a little fishing, but the lake has already been fished almost empty. So it's good that the nickel plant thrives particularly well when nothing else really grows properly.
7 or 8 years ago, we planted maize here. Wheat and beans too, but it was simply not worth it. This is why the soil has been left uncultivated. As you can see for yourself, many hectares of land are not farmed. It is simply not profitable here. The soil is very poor in nutrients and the costs of cultivation cannot be recovered.
So now the farmers are harvesting yellow tuft instead. And indeed, when the ground is properly cultivated, the plant grows even better than it did before. This year's harvest is really good.
We are satisfied so far. Up there we have been conducting an experiment where I have tilled the soil with the tractor. Here in front of us too, I've been working on the plot with the tractor. If you compare that, you can immediately see the difference between the plants with and without special cultivation.
The French agricultural scientist Guillaume Echevarria from the University of Nancy is overseeing the nickel plant project. He has a kind of miniature X-ray device. With its help, the researcher is able to check the quality of the harvest.
I'm checking the nickel content in different plant parts, and the most interesting part is the leaves. So the leaf now has between 1% and 2% nickel.
So the harvest is a success for both the scientists and the farmers, although they were still very skeptical about this to begin with.
You're coming to a place and you pretend that you want to grow the wheat that have been annoying them for centuries. That's funny. But of course, now they see the interest. I mean, we know we can give them the actual value of things. We say, okay, a ton of biomass is worth $80 because we can recover energy from it, we can recover nickel, and this is a good value.
The next day, Guillaume Echevarria takes us on a small expedition to a nearby mountain summit. Also present, Echevarria's colleague Emil Benizri and phytomining pioneer Alan Baker.
So this is, you're stepping on Plantago, maybe Olosteum, or looking like it. One of the small ones.
The three researchers want to study hyperaccumulator plants in their natural environment.
They should be here like dozens.
They're looking for Alyssum smolicanum, a close relative of yellow tuft.
Guillaume, yeah? Just come and have a look here.
Okay. Hey, there is one here.
Well, that looks so different.
Yeah,
to the Alyssum morale, doesn't it? Now I'm going to take a little clump of leaves here and then fold the paper across and then really press it hard to try and press out as much as I can of the sap. And if it's a bit tough like this one, you can actually help it a bit by biting it. And just press a bit more once the leaf has broken up, and then I'll open up the paper and lo presto, a wonderful pink colour. And that shows that that's a very, very strong metal hyperaccumulator.
More than 500 different hyperaccumulators have now been identified by scientists. Nobody knows how many plants like these exist altogether. Over the last few years, a veritable race to discover new superplants has begun all over the world.
Since then, I've discovered a few plant species, new plant species, and of course new hyperaccumulators. And I think this has been a very, a strong force to drive me to phytomining application.
Guillaume Echevarria checks the nickel harvest one last time. The plants will be left in the fields for another couple of days to dry in the sun. They will then be transported to France, where the researchers will extract nickel from the plant. Incidentally, the yellow tuft is officially declared a medicinal plant because there is still no entry for nickel plants in the EU customs forms. We will meet Guillaume Echevarria again in France, in Nancy. The university city has developed into a centre for phytomining research in recent years. In a research station on the edge of the city, the scientists further process the harvest from Albania.
The first stage is the plant, which is harvested and either baled or put into bags. So this is one bag that we usually receive. So this is ready for grinding. So then we have the ground biomass.
The ground plants are now burned in a furnace.
Show you a sample of the ground biomass. So it's yellowish, and mostly because the flower of Aliso murale is yellow, and it is flowering when we harvest the plant.
The whole process is designed with sustainability in mind. Not only nickel, but also energy is produced by the incineration process. The research station is heated with the help of the connected boiler.
We can burn as much as 50 kilograms of biomass per day. Of course, in that case, it is even more than what the building needs for heating.
The nickel becomes concentrated in the ash as a result of burning. Whereas the plants contain only 1 to 2% metal, the nickel content of the ash is considerably higher.
Product is our end product, which is the bio-ore, the ash. This is a bag of, let's say, approximately 5 kilograms of ash, and this contains almost 1 kilogram of nickel.
This bio-ore is further processed in the chemistry laboratory of the University of Nancy. Here is where the nickel is finally obtained from the ashes. Not metallic nickel, though. That would certainly be possible, but would not be financially worthwhile. Instead, the chemists produce special nickel compounds that achieve significantly higher prices on the market. After all, nickel compounds are found in many products that we use every day.
Nickel salts are used in industry for the treatment of surfaces in, for example, the aviation and automotive industries. There, metal parts are immersed in baths of nickel-based materials to protect them from corrosion. These compounds are used for this purpose: nickel oxides, acetates, and phosphates. But we can also manufacture special nickel oxides, which are then used in paints and coatings, for ceramics and glass, for art objects and for coating spectacle lenses. The burned plants produce ash. This ash contains not only nickel but also calcium, potassium, magnesium and other elements. First, we need to separate out the potassium. The potassium is removed by rinsing with water, and the nickel must then be transferred into a solution. This is done by mixing the ash with acid. The nickel is now in the solution, and we must now separate the ash from the solution in order to obtain nickel.
Séparer les cendres et la solution pour récupérer le nickel.
It seems a little like modern alchemy. The ash solution is filtered. The result is a shimmering green liquid that looks very similar to the sap of the nickel tree in New Caledonia. The nickel compounds are finally precipitated through the addition of certain chemicals. In theory, this should also work with other metals. Harvest and dry the plants, shred them, burn them to ashes, and finally produce the finished metal compound in the laboratory.
There are many metals that can be accumulated by plants. I'm often asked whether gold can also be accumulated. The answer is yes, but it's very difficult. When you consider the value of gold, it could be interesting, but it's only possible within a very limited scope.
Because there is as yet no plant that really draws much gold from the ground, the researchers in Nancy are concentrating on other expensive metals. There are, for example, plants that are able to accumulate the so-called rare earth elements, metals that are found in mobile phones and computers. But the scientists currently have especially high hopes for plants that are able to accumulate platinum and palladium. These noble metals are employed in catalytic converters, for example, and in medical technology. The researchers have just started a new experiment.
So here we are experimenting in controlled conditions the capacity of a very interesting plant, Berkheya kodii from South Africa, to accumulate other metals than nickel. This plant is known as a real strong nickel hyperaccumulator, several percent in the leaves. And it was recently found that it also accumulates cobalt, but also platinum and palladium, which are very expensive metals.
Berkheya kodii, the super plant. A major field trial with this plant will be starting very soon in South Africa. This could be the definitive breakthrough for phytomining.
The idea with those metals is like gold. Their price is so high that the ore that is being currently mined in South Africa contains 0.001% platinum or palladium. That means if we get, let's say, 0.01% platinum or palladium in the leaves, and if we ash the leaves, then we get ores that are 100 times richer in platinum or palladium than the ones that are currently mined.
But the scientists in Nancy are not only testing new plants, they're also attempting to optimize the cultivation of the hyperaccumulators that are already known. In this test chamber, they're investigating how the roots of yellow tuft are able to grow in an ideal manner. For example, by cultivating it together with other plants that loosen the soil. This could help the yellow tuft to penetrate down to even deeper soil layers and extract nickel from that part of the ground too. The researchers also now know that certain bacteria in the soil facilitate the uptake of metals. In the biology laboratory of the University of Nancy, these bacteria are being studied by doctoral student Séverine Lopez.
When we harvest plants, we also collect the soil that sticks to the roots. It's from this soil that we then obtain the bacteria.
This research is also still in its infancy, but soon bacteria like these could help to ensure that the metal harvest turns out even better.
These bacteria are sourced directly from the root environment of the hyperaccumulator plants. We isolate them and examine them to determine their activities. These can be advantageous for the plants. They improve growth or mobilize the metals in the soil and thus enable the plants to absorb the metals more effectively.
In an experimental garden, the university has established an underground experimental station. The abilities of the superplants to decontaminate soil are the main focus of research here. The technical term for this, phytoremediation.
This is called a lysimeter, a large cylinder that contains soil. The cylinder is 2 meters high and has a surface area of 1 square meter. The soil comes from a contaminated location at which we wish to determine the evolution of pollutants and at the same time investigate the treatment of pollutants using chemical or biological processes. The cylinder is therefore equipped with probes and measuring systems which allow us to take water samples. This enables us to see which substances are in the ground and how they react to various treatments, to chemical processes, but also to phytoremediation.
It's probably this interdisciplinary approach that makes the University of Nancy so successful. Biologists, agronomists and chemists are working together here on the future of superplants. And they don't need any dubious investors looking to make a quick profit from this, because the EU is backing their research with funding in the millions. We travel onwards to Germany, the last stop on our journey to the superplants. Bestvig in the Sauerland region. At this remote location, lead was mined for centuries. This activity has left the soil very heavily contaminated with lead and cadmium. The area looks remarkably green, but that impression is deceptive. All the plants that grow here have found a way to deal with the heavy metal pollution. Many of them are able to prevent the absorption of heavy metals into their roots. Some accumulate the pollutants. But to other plants, people and animals, the soil here is downright toxic.
These soils are extremely heavily contaminated. They are some of the most highly contaminated soils that we have found. When we sampled various mining locations throughout the whole of Europe, Bestvig was close to the maximum. Our record holders are in Poland, but Bestvig comes just behind them. Present in the soil are zinc in the upper percentage range and several % of lead. We also have very high cadmium values. The values are so high that food should not be grown here under any circumstances.
The cadmium in particular is troublesome for nature. Cadmium is extremely harmful to humans, attacking kidneys and bones. For plants too, cadmium is a problem. And yet there is a plant that not only withstands the cadmium, but even accumulates it, meadow rock cress. Arabidopsis halleri. It flourishes in Bestvik even in places where nothing else grows. In future, it could be used for the decontamination of industrial sites. This could also work here, but it will be a task for generations to come.
We must realize that a substantial part of the soil consists of heavy metals that must be removed. So when the soil is that heavily contaminated, it takes a long time. We're talking centuries.
That's why Ute Kramer is here gathering plants that could later be employed for decontaminating other sites, in industrial areas that are contaminated with heavy metals, but not to the same extreme as in Bestvik.
They are brought to our greenhouse to recover a little. There we take leaf samples and we also take a soil sample in order to find out about the conditions and the characteristics of the plant at the site. Then we harvest the leaves. We take DNA from them, that is, we extract the genetic information in order to carry out further analysis.
The plants from Bestvik are thus used for fundamental research, so that cadmium decontamination can be further improved at some point. This is important because cadmium is a problem throughout Central Europe. In the greenhouse, Ute Kramer collects plants from contaminated soils from every corner of the continent. Cadmium pollution is particularly high at many places in Germany.
Significant areas of German soil are severely contaminated with heavy metals. That is certainly the case, and there is nobody who is responsible for somehow dealing with or mitigating this so-called legacy contamination. So there it stays. Furthermore, much of it comes from eastern Germany. The former owners are gone.
Ute Kramer has been studying hyperaccumulators for many years. However, she isn't concerned about harvesting metals in order to make money. She wants to understand how metal accumulation functions at the genetic level, and indeed, why hyperaccumulators do this at all. So far, there are only theories. For example, that the plant uses the toxic metals to protect itself against insects and other foragers. But Ute Kramer can also envisage a different explanation.
It's possible that by accumulating metals in their leaves and then shedding the leaves, the plants locally enrich the ground with metals, so that competing plants are no longer able to colonize the immediate neighborhood. So the plants create space at their location and are thus better able to hold their own against the competition. The plant accumulates these metals in its leaves, which at some point die away and are biologically degraded, thus returning the metals to the soil, which are then concentrated in the vicinity of the plant, so that any non-tolerant plant in the immediate proximity of this plant is no longer able to grow and is thus no longer any competition. This is a major problem for plants. When they grow too closely together, one plant ends up in the shadow of others and is eventually no longer able to exist because it's unable to survive. Perhaps that's how Arabidopsis halleri is able to protect itself against nearby competing plants.
Nobody knows what the researchers will go on to discover in the coming years. Perhaps in the future, spoil heaps and toxic waste dumps actually will be cleaned up on a large scale with the aid of these plants. And perhaps the sale of the metals obtained in this way will someday really make it possible to protect the environment while earning money at the same time.
I believe that the time has come to discover and describe this vast biodiversity to ensure that we have the resources from which it may be possible to develop these technologies. I think there is still far too little money in this area. Its potential has still not been properly grasped. If technology like this becomes a reality one day, then we will have taken a huge step forward in our work in actually identifying the most extreme plants.
A distant vision of the future? Not just that. In Albania, the vision is already a reality. For the farmers there, the superplants are already a blessing now. They're earning money with the nickel plants and at the same time improving their soils.
All the farmers have welcomed this project. It will be a good opportunity for them if it is subsidized, or if the project is expanded. These people are interested in it because it is the only source of income for the owners of these plots in the foreseeable future. I think our children will also continue with it. It is our only chance.
It will be a nice coincidence of nature if the solution to some environmental problems had been waiting for centuries where nobody would have imagined it, in inconspicuous plants. Plants with which we could mine for metals in a gentler way, and at the same time atone at least a little for a few of the worst environmental sins.